Alright, welcome back to Hebrew. This is going to be lesson number 2, and we are in chapter 2 of the first Hebrew Primer 3rd edition. Link for this will be in the description in case you still need it and want to check it out. So I'm going to start by reviewing the first 11 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the first vowels that we learned, and then we'll move on to chapter 2 and start working through that, which will be the rest of the alphabet. So I have to excuse how they're not really lined up that well. Sorry. But these are the first 11 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. We have Aleph, Beit, Veit, and just for the sake of going through the alphabet, I'm just going to treat these as two different letters, even though they're the same letter. It's just this one has a dagesh in it, so the consonant has a harsher sound. So we have Aleph, Beit, Veit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod. This little one here is Yod, Kaf, and Chaf. So these are the first 11 consonants, first 11 letters, and I'm going to go through the first 4 vowels that we know. The first 4 vowels that we know are Kametz and Patach, which both have the open ah sound. Then we have a hirik and a hirik yod, which is pretty obvious because it's a hirik with a yod, so it's hirik yod, and these both have the long e sound. So these are the first 4 vowels that we know. And with the letters that we know so far, along with their vowels, there's actually a good number of Hebrew words that we should be able to pronounce at this point, just by reading it in the text. So I'm trying to color code these a little bit to make it easier. So I'm trying to do the consonants with black and the vowels with green, just so it's just easier to tell the difference. And these are all in exercise 7 of chapter 1. So these are all words that if you did the exercises, you should already have come across these. So I'll just go through how to pronounce these. Close, thank you. And there we go. So the first one we have here, and obviously this is not all of them in exercise 7. I just picked ones that were pretty simple, just to illustrate. So this first one here, we have ach, which is the word for brother. So let's see you pronounce it. It's an aleph with a kametz underneath, and then the chet. You have the next one, which is av, an aleph with a kametz and a veit. So that's Av. This is the word for father. It's actually part of where we get the name Abraham. It's Avraham, which is father of many nations, or the name before the change, which is Avram, which is great father. Both come from Av, which is father. Next one is Ahav, an aleph with a kametz, and then a hey with a patak, ending with a veit. This is the verb for love, sort of the base form, I guess you could say, ahav. Although technically third person masculine singular, but we'll get into that when we get into verbs. Don't get caught up on that. This next one here is David, which should be easy to recognize. It's the name David. So you have a dalet with a kametz, a vav with a hirik, ending with another dalet. So David. The next one we have here is haya, which is the verb to be. A hey with a kametz, a yod with a kametz, ending with a hey. You'll get really familiar with this one in later chapters when we go through verbs. This is not a regular verb, so it takes on a lot of different variations, which we have to know. So again, we'll get to that. This next one is the word he. You have a hey with a tsere yod. That's why the yod is green and not black here, because this is actually part of the vowel sound. This is a hey, hirik yod, ending with an aleph. And I'm going to come back to this and explain a little bit more, because this can actually be a bit confusing to try and know the sound for. But we'll come back to that. This is yad. It's a yod with a kametz ending with a dalet. This is the word for hand. Then the next one is a yod with a dalet, a not a dalet, a yod with a kametz, a dalet with a kametz, ending with a hey, and this is the verb to know. So coming back here to this word he, which means she, there's actually sort of a funny, I don't know what the phrase, an adage, I guess, to learning Hebrew. Who is he and he is she? So, again, we'll get to that later. You don't have to write all these down. These are all words that we're going to come across when we go through the book. And you're going to know these like by heart, because these are pretty frequent ones. Actually, out of all these, I think the most irregular one would probably be ahav. Maybe yad. But regardless. So when you're reading Hebrew, you have to keep in mind the pattern that you have to go through when you're trying to read a word. So for instance, in Hebrew, it always goes consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. Every word in Hebrew starts with a consonant and it ends with a consonant, and that's very important to know. In terms of writing, now in pronunciation, it might sound like a word starts with a vowel. For instance, this word here, ach, like if you hear it, the word ach, it sounds like it starts with a vowel. But when you write it, it has to start with a consonant. That's why you have letters like the aleph, which are silent letters. They take a vowel. But when writing it, you always start with the consonant first, then you go to its vowel. Then you move on to the next consonant and its vowel, and so on and so forth. So you're kind of reading, starting here, going down, going up, going down, going up, going down. I'll actually draw this out to maybe illustrate this. And this might be a little too detailed. Maybe this isn't interesting, but for some it might be helpful. So when you're reading Hebrew, your eyes kind of go like this. They'll start here where the consonant is, then you'll look around for the vowel, which usually it's going to be below the letter. Not always, but it's pretty common that it's below the letter. Then you'll move on to the next consonant, so your eyes go up again. Then you go down, check out the vowel. Then you move on to the next consonant. Again, this might not mean much to a lot of people, but I have met people where explaining it this way has helped a lot in learning how to read and sort of getting into the rhythm of reading through a word in Hebrew. So to illustrate, what's a good one? I guess this one right here, this verb haya. So when you start reading it, you start with the hey. You always start with the consonant. So you start with the consonant. All right, we know that. That's the hey. So we know the breathy H sound, the ha. All right, so now we got to look for the vowel. Well, the vowel is right underneath it, so our eyes go down. And that's a comet. So you have the first syllable, which is ha. Then your eyes go back up, check out what the vowel is, the consonant. Your eyes go up to check out what the consonant is. The consonant is a yod. All right, we know that one. It's ya, that Y sound. Then we look for its vowel, which is a kametz. So we know the second syllable is ya. And then it ends with a hey. But there's no vowel around the hey, so it's not really pronounced. Sort of like in English, when a word ends with an H, you don't really pronounce the H. It's just sort of there. Same thing in Hebrew sometimes. You might have a letter, like either it's an aleph, or a hey, or an ayin, which is another letter that we'll get to today, where you don't pronounce it, but it's there because, again, in Hebrew, every word has to end in a consonant. Whether that consonant's pronounced or not, when you write it, it has to end in a consonant. So you have hayya. So that's how you would read that one. So here, again, I said I'd come back to this because this word is a little tricky. Because when you see it, it's obviously in the text, it's not color-coded like I have here. So really, when you look at this, when you first see it, you might say, okay, there's three consonants here. You have the hey, the yod, and the aleph, but there's only one vowel, which is the hirik. So how do you pronounce this? Is it he? Like, do you pronounce the yod like a yod, or is the yod a part of the vowel? Well, one of the clues is the yod doesn't have a vowel with it. So if you want to treat the yod like it's a consonant, like if you want to say, okay, you have a a hey and a huric, and then next you have a yod with no vowel, well, then there's nothing to connect the yod to the next letter, which is the aleph. Now, if we were to take the aleph out of this word and just have a hey with a huric and a yod, then, well, first, I'm pretty sure that's not a word in Hebrew because that'd be really weird to pronounce. But you could take the yod without a vowel. Like you could just say, all right, this is pronounced he, which again is not a word, but regardless. So now you have this. And again, all of the consonants have to be connected in Hebrew with a vowel. Because again, when you write out Hebrew, you always have to go consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. That's a pretty standard rule. You don't really have two consonants in a row and then a vowel. You don't have a consonant and then two vowels when writing it out. So I guess you'd call this like a compound vowel. I just kind of made that up. Well, there are sort of compound vowels, but get into that later. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent with this. But the point is, this is pronounced he, and because the yod does not have a vowel, it's sort of a giveaway that the yod is actually a part of the vowel construction. So that's why this is actually a hey and an aleph, and the hey has a huric yod vowel. So I know I just sort of went into a lot of detail there. If that's confusing to anyone, I apologize, but don't get too worried about getting hung up on all the technicalities because those get fleshed out as time goes on. Plus, you just kind of get used to seeing constructions like this. So, like, it won't take long before you just don't really think about it. You sort of see it, your mind knows what to do with it, and then you move on. So this word is pronounced he. So that's sort of the review. Again, I'm not going to go through all the exercises because there's a lot there. So let's just go ahead and move on to chapter 2 of the book, which is the completion of the alphabet, the final 11 letters, and closing out with the other vowels. So in chapter 2, at the beginning, we're introduced to these 6 letters. Again, this is actually the same letter, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to treat this as 2 letters for now as we go through the alphabet. So the first letter we have in this chapter is Lamed. I always remember Lamed because it looks a little bit like a lightning bolt, which starts with an L. So this is Lamed, and that's the sound that it has, is the L sound. The next letter is Mem, the M sound. And if you're kind of following along in your head, some letters in the Hebrew alphabet sort of follow, like in terms of sound, like the sound that they make, it kind of follows along sometimes with the English alphabet. Like we have L, M, and N. Well, in Hebrew we have Lamed, Mem, and Nun. So Mem has the M sound and Nun has the N sound, like noon, which is what the letter is. So we have Lamed, Mem, Nun. The next letter is Samek, which I always remember, if anyone has studied Greek, it's kind of a backwards sigma, a lowercase sigma. So this is Samek. This one is an ayin. And this one is similar to Aleph because it is a silent letter. So this one does not have a sound. I know it can be confusing at first because it looks like the English letter Y. But this one is a silent consonant. It does not have a sound. And this last one is Pe and Fe. So with the Dagesh in it, it has, again, the harsher consonant sound, Pe. Without the Dagesh, it has the softer sound of Fe. So these are the first 6 letters. Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Fe. So now we're going to look at the first vowels that this chapter introduces. And these are the first 3 vowels of this chapter. First, over here we have a segal. It's the 3 dots underneath the letter. a segal, and this has the eh sound, like in bed, or Ted, or peg. That's a segal. The next one we have here is a tsere. This has the long A sound. These two dots next to each other has the A sound. Also, you have a tsere yod. So similar to a heroic yod, the yod does not change how the vowel is sounded, but the yod is a part of the vowel. And you'll see this in both constructions. Sometimes you might see just a tsere, sometimes you'll see a tsere yod. So it really just depends on the word, but these are the first three vowels of this chapter. Something else to keep in mind when you're going through the book, it's good to do the checkup words, check out the look-alike letters, and also to do the reading practice. I know it might seem really redundant when you start going through it, but again, and I'm just going to keep saying this, getting down the alphabet and the vowels is really important, and it's going to make learning the rest of Hebrew a lot easier because you're not going to have to keep going back and referencing what these letters are, what these vowels are. So go ahead and really work on memorizing these and getting them down. The sooner the better. And now I'm going to go over the last letters of the alphabet, as well as the last two vowels that this chapter gives us. And these are the final 6 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So this first letter, the first of the last 6 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, is a tzadeh. It has the sound of like the English TS combination. Like the example they give in the book is like in nuts. It has the ts sound. This next letter is a kof. It has a very hard k sound, which really isn't all that different from a cough with a dagesh in it. Pronunciation-wise, it's going to be the same for how we're going to use it. The following letter is a resh. And this is one I mentioned in the last video, where if you listen to someone speaking Hebrew, sometimes it might sound like resh. Again, where it's pronounced in the throat. We'll just pronounce it like an English R. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. So this is a resh. The next one here, these 2 letters, it looks like sort of the beit, veit, pay, fei thing, where it's like the same letter, but just depending on where the dot is, it'll be different. But these are actually 2 separate letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It's not the same letter with just a slight variation, 2 separate letters. The first one, where the dot is on the top right, is called a shin, and it has that sh sound, a sh. The next one is a sin, which has just the flat s sound. Then to end, we have a tav, which when I was learning Hebrew, it always helped me to think of, because it looks a little bit like a top hat. That's kind of missing a bit, but this is a tav, which is pronounced the same way as a tet, kind of the circular looking one. The difference, though, if you really want to get into it, sometimes in Hebrew that's been translated to English, you'll have words that have the th construction, the sound. Like in Bethlehem or Bethel. But there's no letter in Hebrew that we've gone over that has the th sound. So where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from this letter tav. So depending on how a word is constructed, and again, I'm not going to get picky on this, this is just some side knowledge for you. Depending on how a word is constructed, this will actually have either the harsh T sound, or it'll have the softer the sound. So this is actually where we get the words like Bethel and Bethlehem. They're words that have the tav in them. So that's where that sound comes from. So just a fun fact for you. Like the word Ruth, or I should say the name Ruth. When we spell it out in Hebrew, a lot of times we might pronounce it root, like just for the sake of going through the exercises and knowing the sounds of Hebrew. When we see it, we might say root, but it's actually pronounced Ruth because of how the word is constructed. So these are the last 6 letters of the Hebrew alphabet: Tzadeh, Kof, Resh, Shin, Sin, and Tav. So I'm going to put in the video description actually a link to the alphabet song in Hebrew. There's a couple versions of it out there. One of them has like verses to it. I don't really like that one, just for the sake of practicing the alphabet. So I'm going to link kind of an abbreviated form of the alphabet song in Hebrew that only goes through the Hebrew letters. So that's a good one to keep in mind. I often play it in my head when I'm spelling out Hebrew, just to get in mind what the letter is and all that stuff. So I'll put that in the description. So let's look now at the final vowels that this chapter gives us. So I wrote this a little different than how it is in the book, and I apologize. It looks like the video is a bit blurry. I'm not quite sure how to change that. So I'm sorry if this is blurry, but again, you should be following along in the book, because if not, these videos really aren't going to make that much sense anyways. So here we have a cholam vowel, and this is a dot in the top, or to the top left of the consonant. And this is a cholam. It has the long O sound. You also have its variation, which is called a full cholam, which has a vav underneath the cholam, underneath that dot. And they both have the same sound, which is the long O sound. The next vowel we're going to look at, this is called I want to make sure I pronounce this right. This is a kibitz. It's 3 dots going on a diagonal underneath the consonant. This has the long oo sound. And this next one is called a shurik. And this one also has the long oo sound, same with the kibitz. And this one is a vav with the dot inside of it. And it's, again, going to be to the left of the consonant. So we have a cholam and a full cholam, which have the long O sound. And here we have a kibitz and a shurik that both have the long oo sound. And just for clarity, if you're having a hard time remembering the names of these vowels, the only reason that I mentioned the names is so that, as we're reading along, if we can't think of the sound that a vowel makes, it's good to know the name of the vowel, because within the name you get the sound, which is the same reason I'm teaching the names of the letters, which is something that the book actually doesn't do. So this is a cholam, full cholam, kibutz, and a shurik. So these are the final vowels that this chapter gives us. There are a couple more vowels that we'll get into. For instance, the shiva, which is a very important vowel, but it functions a little differently than the other ones. But we'll get into that in later chapters. But this is how this chapter concludes, is by giving these vowels here. And as you're looking in the book, again, I would recommend reading all the notes that go along with this. Some of them I've touched on, some of them I haven't. And also knowing the look-alike letters, because it can be confusing. Some of the Hebrew letters do look very similar and can be very confusing. Like even myself, even though I've taught this before and I've done a lot of reading in Hebrew, sometimes I'll come across a couple letters and I misassociate them. So some letters can be very confusing. So it's good to know the differences there. And always do the reading practice, because that's going to help out a lot. So now we're going to conclude with something I mentioned in the last video. If you remember, I mentioned that in Hebrew there's no uppercase or lowercase of letters, but there are 5 end forms. So we're going to go over that right now. And there are 5 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that have, again, what we call end forms, which means when you see these letters at the end of a word, they take on a different form. So these are the 5 letters. We have a kaf, mem, nun, pei, and a tzadeh. And these all take on a different form when they're at the end of a word. So I'm going to start with the kaf. When you see a cough at the beginning or within a word, it's going to look like this. But when it's at the end of a word, it's going to look like this. It's going to have a top that's very similar to like a dalet, but it's going to have a very long tail. It's going to drop below the writing line. So, it actually might be helpful for me to sort of do this. Alright, so I drew out here what I would consider the writing line. So, like if you're writing this on a lined piece of paper and you're writing any other letter in Hebrew, like, I don't know, you're just writing something out. Something like that, maybe. It's going to fall on the writing line. But end forms, most of them actually drop below the writing line, which makes them stand out from the other letters in a word, which is a good clue that you're dealing with an end form. So like I said, over here, this is cough. And a cough drops below the writing line. It has the top that's similar to a dalet, but it has an elongated tail, and usually you'll actually see a vowel within the word. It might be a comets, which is a pretty common one to find in there, or it'll be a shiva, which a shiva, again, we'll get into what a shiva is exactly later, but for now, a shiva is just 2 dots. And you'll see a cough in its end form with either a comets or a shiva within the letter. And you may remember when I said recently that in Hebrew, when you write it, you always start with a consonant and you always end with a consonant. This is kind of an exception because, as you might already be wondering, well, if you have a cough at the end of a word and it has a vowel in it, like a comets or like a shiva, then wouldn't you pronounce that, or are you supposed to not pronounce that? Because then the word wouldn't be ending with a consonant, it'd be ending with a vowel. Well, that's true. So if you see this at the end of a word, it's going to be pronounced like you would pronounce any other consonant-vowel combination. You pronounce the consonant first, then you go to the vowels. This would end with a cha. That's how you would pronounce this. You pronounce the kaf, and then the comets, it'd be a cha. So that's how that would end, and that's what the end form of a kaf looks like. So let's move on to the following ones. So the next one we're going to look at is a mem. This is what it looks like at the beginning and within a word. At the end of a word, it looks kind of boxy, and then it sort of extends out the top there. So that's what a mem looks like. A nun is similar to a kaf because it drops below the writing line, but it's shorter on top. It actually looks like an elongated vav. But this is what a nun looks like at the end of a word. And a pei and a tzadeh follow a very similar rule with dropping below the line. And they're very easy to distinguish because they start off looking exactly like they do in the other form, except a pei drops below the line and a tzadeh does the same thing. A tzadeh kind of looks like a backwards Y, and I usually write it like this, just to distinguish it. And they're pretty easy to tell. For instance, like a pei, it looks like a pei, it's just the tail isn't rounded, it just goes straight down. Same thing with a tzadeh. It looks like a tzadeh, except instead of this line bending back, the line just goes straight down. So these are the final end forms. These are 5 end forms that are important to know because you're going to see them a lot. But the good news is that, like any of the letters and any of the vowels, if you study them enough, then once we start getting to the words, you just don't even think about it. And looking forward in the chapter as it concludes, again, doing the reading practice, looking at the look-alike letters, looking at some of the pronunciations, because there are some homonyms in Hebrew. For instance, it gives the example that a veit and a vav are both homonyms. They both have the same V sound. Aleph and ayin are both silent letters. You have 3 letters that make the ch sound. You have the samek and the sin, which both make the S sound. You have a kof and a kaf, which both make the k sound. and a tav and a tet, which we've already talked about, that both have the T sound. And then for exercises, I would recommend doing exercises 1, 2, 3, 6, and 8. Those seem to be pretty good ones to do for now. And then, yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this chapter. And then the next chapter, which should come out in a week, we're going to do chapter 3, which is going over the Shiva, which I've already mentioned a little bit here, going through some other vowels, and then talking about the Dagesh, which we've actually kind of already talked about, so it shouldn't be that difficult. So do those exercises for chapter 2. Again, the exercises are 1, 2, 3, 6, and 8. So you can go ahead and get those done, and then I'll see you next week.